Hi, today we're going to be making a beautiful on-point quilt using quarter log cabin blocks and some sashing. To make the log cabin blocks, you're going to need a light, a medium, and a dark fabric and an accent fabric. We're going to start with cutting our accent fabric into 3-inch strips. We've cut those into 3-inch strips. We're going to cut them into 3-inch blocks, and you should end up with 40 blocks. We're then going to cut our light, medium, and dark fabric into 3-inch strips as well. Next, we'll need to cut our background fabric into 1.5-inch strips. Set our wet background fabric aside because later we're going to be cutting 3-inch strips and some big squares for the triangles in our quilt. To make our log cabin blocks, we're going to start by sewing our 3-inch squares, our accent fabric, to our 1.5-inch strip background fabric using a 1/4-inch seam. Once we have these sewed together, we're going to cut them apart. Once we've cut these apart, we're going to press our seams open, and we're going to press all the seams open in this quilt. When I first started out ironing, I tried pressing the seams to the dark side, but you end up with too much bulk as you continue to make this block, so you really do need to press your seams open. Once you have pressed these blocks, you're going to once again sew them to a 1.5-inch strip of background fabric, and you want to do it so that the background fabric will form an L. Now that they're sewn onto our background fabric, we're going to cut them apart. For this quilt, we're going to be doing mostly chain piecing and then cutting the pieces apart. There'll be very little pre-cutting of any fabric for this quilt. Now that we have our background fabric sewed onto two sides of our accent fabric, our little squares, we're going to press our seams open. To build onto this block, we're going to take a 3-inch strip of our fabric, the lightest color that we have, and we're going to sew it on to one of the sides of this block that have the background fabric. So we're going to be building onto this block on the sides of it that have the background fabric. Once your blocks are sewn onto your 3-inch strip, you're going to need to cut them apart. So once you have these cut out, we're going to press the seams open or finger press them open if you're comfortable with that, and we're going to build onto our next side of this block. From here, we're going to sew a 3-inch strip of our lightest fabric to the other side of this block that has the background fabric. When you've sewn all of your blocks to a 3-inch strip, you're going to then cut them apart. So for this block, we're going to keep building out from our accent fabric. We're going to make L's. We made an L with the white background fabric. We made an L with the light blue fabric you see here. And then I'm going to go next, I'm going to go and get my medium color, and I'm going to sew that onto this block, creating another L. So from here, I picked a medium color fabric and I sewed that on in an L shape, and then I sewed my dark shade on in an L pattern as well. And then the block is complete. This is your block, and you'll need to make 39 of these blocks. So here's a photo of how I have the fabric under my sewing machine. I like to put the 3-inch strip on the bottom, and then I put my block on top. That way, as I'm sewing it, I can see that I'm coming across my seam, and I can make sure that I sew that open. And I like chain piecing it this way because it's not a lot of pre-cutting when you first start making this quilt, and it just seems to be a lot faster. Once you have your light, medium, and dark fabric sewn onto your block, you'll want to give it a good pressing. If you've been finger pressing all along, I would just take it to the iron and give it a good pressing. From here, we're going to trim our blocks. And what you want to do, I'm not going to tell you to trim this to an exact size. Your 1/4 inch seam may be a little bigger or a little smaller than mine. And this pattern is pretty forgiving. So what you want to do is you want to look at your 39 blocks and trim them all to the same exact size. That's the most important thing, is just make sure all of these blocks are the same. And for me, I ended up trimming mine to 10 3/4 inch, so it was a 10 3/4 inch square. So if you trim your blocks to be 11-inch square or 10 1/2 inch square, that would be perfectly fine. This will all work out as long as your blocks are the same size. So the next important step to making this quilt is to lay out your squares. And if you can lay them out on a floor, or if you have a design wall, it's best to lay these out and keep them laid out, because this quilt is really easy to make, and it's really quick, but being on the diagonal, the corners kind of get a little mixed up, like if you don't lay this out. So you really need to lay this out, and then if you have to pick it up or move it, I would take a photograph of it just to be safe, so that you know how these pieces are going to fit together. Also, like for me, I use different colors. Like I had a couple different shades that were light, a couple different mediums. So my blocks are different, and then you want to lay them out so that you like the way they look. In this layout, for some reason, all my dark colors seem to group together in the middle. So I repositioned them before I got them where I finally wanted them to be. I would also suggest labeling these, especially if you're using different fabrics and you're trying to go for like a random effect, but you want them in a certain position. I started with the very top block on the left here that you see. I called row 1, and then I went each row, row 2, to the very last single block was my row 9. And then you can even within the row, you can label them block 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever. And you'll know exactly how they're going to go into place if that's important to you. It's less important if you've used the same fabric for every block, because they're going to be exactly the same. So we're going to start putting this quilt together, and we're going to do that with sashing. And you're going to need 3-inch strips of your background fabric. And to make this quilt, you're going to need about 4 yards of your background fabric. But for this part right here, to start with, you should just go ahead and cut 1 yard of 3-inch strips for now. We're going to be cutting large squares later in the video, and you don't want to get to the point where you don't have enough fabric to do that, because you're going to need solid pieces for that. So to start off, I would cut about 1 yard of 3-inch strips to start with your sashing. For this sashing, you're going to sew it down the right side of your square. So you want your squares oriented so that the little accent square is in the right hand corner, and you're going to sew this sashing to that side, and you're going to do that for 30 squares. Now, if you have them arranged on your design board and you're using different colors of fabric and you want them in specific places, you're going to have to look at the next slide for the pattern to see which squares that you'll need to sew the sashing to. But if all of your squares are the same, it really doesn't matter where they go. You'll just need to do the sashing to 30 squares. Once you have chain pieced these, you'll want to go ahead and trim them and then get the seams pressed open. So here I have a stack of blocks that have sashing on them, and they've been trimmed and pressed, and that's 30 blocks with the sashing on the right side and 9 blocks without sashing. If you have your squares up on a design board and you've used different fabric and you want to put them in a specific order, here's a look at the pattern. If you're looking at this on the left-hand side, you'll see R1, which is row 1. That block does not get a piece of sashing on the right side, so please take note to that for that one, that sashing is on the bottom. See the position of that. All the others, if you look at them, the short pieces of black rectangles are the sashing that we're talking about right now, and they are on the right side where that orange accent piece of fabric is. As you're looking at this pattern, take note that the pieces of sashing that we're talking about that are on the right side are in the interior of the squares. Like you won't see any on the outside walls of the quilt. They're into the interior, and they are placed on this pattern in case, like I said, you've decided to mix up your colors and you want them in a specific order. This will give you the way that they're going to lay out. Once you have your 30 blocks with your sashing on it, we're going to start sewing those together. And the very first row, one we're going to skip for now. We're going to go on to row 2, which has 3 blocks, and the 3 blocks are sewn together. So 2 have the sashing, and the one on the very right side does not have any sashing. And you're just going to sew them together. So we're going to need to do 2 sets of 3 because row 2 and row 8 in this quilt are the same. So you're going to do 2 sets of 3 sewn exactly the same way. So our next row is row 3, and we're going to sew 5 of these blocks together. The one on the right, the very right, will have no sashing, and the other 4 blocks will have sashing. So you're going to sew them together, and like we did before, we're going to need to do 2 sets of 5. So this will be a row of 5 for row 3, and there'll be a row of 5 for row 7. Here you can see row 2 and 3 laid out with the sashing sewn together. Here you can see rows 7 and 8 with the sashing sewn together. The next 3 rows, row 4, 5, and 6, all contain 7 blocks. Each row contains 6 blocks with sashing, and the block on the right has no sashing. So you'll need to do 3 sets of 7 blocks, and the very block on the very far right will have no sashing. So as you can see by this slide here, the next step is going to be to sew the 3-inch sashing on the bottom of each row, and that is going to be row 1 through row 8. So we'll sew sashing on rows 1 through row 8. And before we do that, before you cut more 3-inch strips, I want to get to the point where we're cutting our big blocks, our triangles that are going to be in this quilt, because they're large and we want to make sure that we can cut them And then if we have 3 inches left over, we can get a strip out of it. We kind of can't do it the other way around. When you're ready to start sewing your sashing on the bottom of your rows, you'll need to lay this out to make sure that you have a long enough piece of sashing sewed together, because some of them are going to be over the length of a strip, over 40 inches, so you'll have to sew a couple together or several pieces together to get a long enough strip for a row. When you do that, you want to make sure that you trim the sashing to be equal with the right and left side of your row. For the large triangles on the sides of your quilt, you're going to need to cut 8 15-inch squares and then cut them in half diagonally. For the corners of this quilt, you're going to need to cut one 18-inch square and then cut it diagonally in each direction, so you'll end up with 4 triangles. And from when using this white fabric to cut these triangles, I would just recommend using some spray starch. All of these are cut on the bias and they have a chance to stretch. Also, with them being on the edge of the quilt, while you're making it and moving it around, you may have the tendency to lift or pull on these as you're moving the quilt. So I would just add a little starch to this. It could help with getting any kind of stretching and keeping that under control. To sew our triangles on, we're going to start with block row 1, and that block was one that you did not sew sashing to the right side of, so there's no sashing on the right side of this block where the accent piece is. You're going to sew the sashing to the bottom of this block, as you can see in the picture, and then you're going to sew a corner piece to the top of this, and then a triangle to the right and left of this. When laying out these triangles, they have a 90-degree corner. You want that corner to be aligned with the edge of the block and the bottom edge of the sashing. So on the right side, you'll have a straight line that'll form a 90-degree angle with your block. That's what you're going to line up. You'll line it up with the bottom of your sashing and then the side of your block, and then you're going to sew down the right side of the block. And there's going to be a dog ear there. You're going to leave that. That's perfectly fine. We want the point of our triangle to extend past our block when we sew it together. And then when you get to the left side, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to line up the bottom edge of your background fabric, the 90-degree, with the bottom edge of the sashing, and then the straight edge with the side of the block. Next, you're going to sew your corner piece to the top of this. And for the corner piece, you're going to want to find the center of that corner piece. You're going to be sewing the long side of the triangle to your block. So you want to find the center of the triangle by maybe folding it or sticking a pin in it. And you want to find the center of your block so that you line them up, and this is sewn on with equal amount of dog ear hanging over each side of the block. As you're working on these rows and you're putting on your triangles and your corner pieces, you're going to have dog ears. You're going to have an overlap there. I would sew through it if you have 2 thicknesses of background fabric, and I would leave those dog ears on until you're absolutely sure that you have sewn that section correctly, because it's real easy to get these turned around and to sew them on backwards. But once you've cut off the dog ear, you may not have enough fabric to take the piece off and reposition it and then sew it back on. Okay, here you can see that I've constructed 3 rows here, and I have my triangles on the ends. You're really going to need to refer to the pattern that I have shown in this video. I would just take a picture of it with your phone to put these triangles on, and you need to not be complacent. You need to use a design wall or floor, because the triangles actually switch their rotation as you're going through this pattern, whether they're on the top or the side. They might be in a different position. And then in the beginning of the quilt, at the top of the quilt, your triangles line up with the bottom of your sashing, but when you get to the middle of the quilt, going towards the middle of the quilt, your triangles need to line up with the top of your row, not your sashing, because the triangles are switched upside down, and then they'll line up with the top of your row and not the bottom sashing. You also have to look out for your corners. You're going to have a corner added to row 4 on the right hand side, and then you're going to have a corner added to the left hand side of row 6, and then when you get to your final row 9, you add your last corner, and you have to make sure that you have this laid out correctly, because your corners get sewn on with the longest part of the triangle being sewed to your block. When you're sewing your corner blocks on to position 2 and 3, you're going to want to find the center of the block and the center of the corner piece to sew that on correctly. And you just need to fold your corner piece in half, give it a little mark, and you'll have the center. When it comes to the block, when you fold that in half, you want to include the distance that includes this 3-inch sashing. So you're going to consider that part of your block when you fold it in half, because that way the corner piece will line up better and you'll have equal amount of dog ears hanging over this. So when you fold that in half, include the 3-inch sashing, find your center mark, and then you can line that up with your corner piece. When you sew on these corner pieces, make sure that you sew across the dog ear, because like I said previously, that is going to give you extra background fabric on the corners of this block so that you can sew a border on or your binding on without cutting them off. So this is row 4 that I'm showing with the second corner block, C2 corner block being sewed on. And this looks a little different because I had sewed a regular triangle on here and had to take that off, seam rip that out, and I had already adjoined it to the row above it. So that's what you're seeing in this video. This is a photo of what the dog ears look like when they're sewn across. When you get to row 9, you're just going to sew 2 triangles onto your block 9, and you don't have any sashing for this block, so there's no 3-inch sashing. You'll just align your triangles with the top of block 9, and then you'll use your last corner piece, C4, to finish up that area. When you're ready to sew your rows together, you're going to have to come up with a way of aligning your squares, and there's not a lot of seams, so you're probably going to have to use a washable marker or something to line this up. What I did was I just took a straight edge and put it against the left side of my blocks and made a mark on the white sashing. And then the row below that, I knew that I could align the left side of my block with that mark I made on the white sashing to keep everything lined up perfectly. As you're doing this, you'll start out where you'll have a center block that each row will kind of line up with, but once you get past row 4, your rows have to shift to the left, so your blocks are kind of shifting to the left. So take note of that, keep an eye on the pattern, and definitely, if you're still doing it, have some way to lay this quilt out so that you can keep things in order. Once you've sewed all the rows together, you're going to notice that your left side and top have less of a border, less background fabric than your right side and the bottom. That's just the way this quilt goes together. You have 2 options. You can trim the right side and the bottom to match the left and the top, or you can add fabric sashing to the left side and top. It's up to you how you want to do this and how you plan to finish it. If you're going to add a border, or if you're just going to trim this and add binding and be done with it, that's up to you. The quilt finishes very large. It finishes at around approximately 76 inches by 112. inches. That's with it untrimmed. And if you wanted to make that smaller, you have 3 rows in this quilt that are 7 blocks long. You could always take out one of those rows and that will reduce the length of your quilt. It's still going to end up with the same width, but that's always an option. Thank you for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.